Imagine discovering a videotape that documents not just a crime, but the systematic torture and murder of innocent women, recorded by the killers themselves as they reveled in their victims' suffering. This isn't the plot of a horror film. This is the horrifying reality of what investigators found in an apartment in Independence, Missouri, in 2006. What they uncovered would shock even the most seasoned detectives and reveal one of the most depraved criminal partnerships in American history. This is the story of Richard Davis and Dena Riley, a couple whose sadistic crimes would terrorize a community, spark a massive interstate manhunt, and ultimately expose the darkest depths of human cruelty. Two women would lose their lives in unimaginable ways. A child would be traumatized, and a nation would be forced to confront the existence of evil that most of us can barely comprehend. In the spring of 2006, Independence, Missouri, seemed like an ordinary working-class city in the Kansas City metropolitan area. People went about their daily lives, unaware that among them lived two individuals planning acts of unspeakable violence. Richard Davis was 52 years old, a man whose outward appearance gave no hint of the monstrous fantasies consuming his mind. Beside him was Dena Riley, 38, his girlfriend and the woman who would become not just a witness to his crimes, but an active participant. Their relationship was toxic and twisted, built on a foundation of drug use, sexual violence, and Davis's dominating personality. But what made this case truly extraordinary and deeply disturbing was not just the brutality of their crimes, but their decision to videotape their actions, creating a permanent record of torture and murder that would later become the key evidence in their prosecution. The first victim was Michelle Huff, Ricci, a woman whose life would be cut tragically short in April 2006. Michelle was someone's daughter, someone's friend, a human being with hopes and dreams and people who loved her. She had no way of knowing when she encountered Davis and Riley that she was walking into a nightmare from which she would never escape. What happened to Michelle in those final hours is almost too horrific to describe. Davis and Riley subjected her to rape, torture, and ultimately murder, all while their video camera rolled, capturing every moment of her suffering. The depravity they inflicted on this woman went beyond anything that could be justified or explained by drugs, mental illness, or any other factor. This was calculated cruelty, sadism in its purest and most disturbing form. After they had finished with Michelle, Davis, and Riley needed to dispose of her body. They set fire to her remains and left them in secluded woods in Clay County, hoping that nature and the flames would erase the evidence of their crime. For a time, it seemed their plan had worked. Michelle's charred remains lay undiscovered, and the couple continued their normal lives as if nothing had happened. But their appetite for violence had only grown stronger. Just 1 month later, in May 2006, they would strike again. Their second victim was Marsha Spicer, another woman who had the terrible misfortune of crossing paths with this murderous couple. Marsha met Davis and Riley under circumstances that seemed ordinary enough, but she soon found herself trapped in Davis's apartment, at the mercy of two people who had already killed once and felt emboldened by getting away with it. What they did to Marsha followed the same horrific pattern: rape, torture, and once again they documented everything on video, preserving their crimes for reasons that speak to the deepest sickness of the human psyche. Some experts believe that for sadists like Davis, the videotapes served multiple purposes. They were trophies, allowing him to relive the experience. They were tools of control and power. And perhaps most disturbingly, they may have been intended for distribution or sharing with others who shared his twisted desires. Marsha's suffering ended when Davis and Riley suffocated her during a sexual assault. Her body was then dumped in a lake, where it would later be discovered by a fisherman who had no idea that his day on the water would turn into a scene from a nightmare. Unlike Michelle's burned remains, Marsha's body was found relatively quickly, and it bore evidence that would prove crucial to the investigation. When authorities examined Marsha's body, they found physical evidence that could be traced back to a specific location and specific individuals. Forensic experts worked meticulously, gathering every fiber, every trace, every possible clue. And slowly, the evidence began pointing in one direction, toward Richard Davis and Dena Riley. As investigators dug deeper into Davis and Riley's lives, they obtained a search warrant for their residence. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Hidden in the apartment were multiple videotapes, and when detectives played them, they witnessed crimes that even veteran law enforcement officers could barely stomach. The tapes showed Michelle Huff Ricci and Marsha Spicer being tortured, raped, and murdered. Every moment of their agony had been captured on film. The discovery of these tapes transformed the investigation. Suddenly, investigators had not just physical evidence, but visual documentation of the crimes themselves. They could see the faces of the perpetrators. They could hear the voices. And most heartbreakingly, they could see the suffering of the victims. The tapes confirmed that there were at least 2 victims, and they provided irrefutable proof of Davis and Riley's guilt. But by the time investigators made this discovery, Davis and Riley had realized the net was closing in. They fled, setting off an 8-day manhunt that would span multiple states and capture national attention. Law enforcement agencies coordinated across state lines, sharing information, posting alerts, and warning the public that 2 extremely dangerous individuals were on the run. And then, the situation became even more horrifying. During their flight from justice, Davis and Riley kidnapped Davis's own 5-year-old niece, a child who should have been safe from harm, especially from her own family. They sexually assaulted this innocent child, adding yet another victim to their list of crimes, and demonstrating that their capacity for cruelty knew no bounds, not even the bounds of family. The kidnapping of a child escalated the urgency of the manhunt. Every available resource was deployed to find Davis, Riley, and the little girl. Media coverage intensified. The public was outraged, and law enforcement officers worked around the clock, knowing that every hour the child remained in their custody increased the danger she faced. Finally, after 8 days that must have felt like an eternity, authorities located and apprehended Davis and Riley. The child was recovered and reunited with family members. The nightmare was over for her, though the psychological scars would remain. And for Davis and Riley, their brief flight from justice was over. Now they would face the full weight of the legal system. Under interrogation, Davis and Riley were confronted with the overwhelming evidence against them. The videotapes left no room for denial. Detectives pressed them for information about their victims, particularly about Michelle Huff Ricci, whose body had not yet been found. Eventually, Davis and Riley disclosed the location where they had left Michelle's remains. Investigators traveled to the secluded woods in Clay County and recovered what was left of her, finally giving her family some measure of closure, however painful. The legal proceedings that followed would be among the most emotionally charged and difficult trials in Missouri history. Prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting evidence so graphic and disturbing that it might overwhelm jurors, yet so crucial that it could not be omitted. Defense attorneys faced the nearly impossible task of defending clients whose crimes had been documented on video, and whose actions seemed to defy any reasonable explanation or mitigation. Richard Davis was charged with 32 felonies, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, rape, and child sexual assault. The sheer number of charges reflected the breadth and severity of his crimes. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that Davis's actions demonstrated such depravity and lack of remorse that only the ultimate punishment was appropriate. During the trial, jurors were shown portions of the torture tapes. Even with preparation and warnings, nothing could truly prepare them for what they witnessed. These were not crime scene photographs or forensic diagrams. These were videos of actual human beings suffering and dying while their killers watched and participated. Some jurors wept, others looked away, but they all understood that what they were seeing represented evil in its most undeniable form. The defense attempted to present mitigating factors, suggesting that Davis had a troubled background, that drugs and alcohol had impaired his judgment, that there were psychological factors at play. But how do you mitigate the unmitigation? How do you explain away videotaped torture and murder? The jury wasn't buying it. They saw through any attempts to portray Davis as anything other than what he was, a sadistic killer who had acted with full knowledge and intent. The verdict came back. guilty on all 32 counts. The jury then had to decide whether Richard Davis should live or die. After considering the evidence, including victim impact statements from the families of Michelle Huff Ricci and Marsha Spicer, the jury recommended death. The judge agreed, sentencing Richard Davis to death for the murder of Marsha Spicer, along with multiple life sentences for his other crimes. Davis's legal team appealed the sentence, taking the case all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court. They argued procedural errors, questioned the admissibility of evidence, and challenged the proportionality of the death sentence. But at every level, the courts affirmed the original verdict and sentence. The evidence was too strong, the crimes too heinous, and the legal proceedings too careful and fair to warrant reversal. Richard Davis would spend the next years on death row, living in a small cell, awaiting the execution that many believed he richly deserved. But fate had a different ending in store. In December 2020, at the age of 56, Richard Davis died of natural causes in prison. He never faced the needle. He never had to account for his crimes in the way the state had planned. He simply died, 14 years after his killing spree, taking whatever dark thoughts and motivations he had to his grave. Dena Riley's case followed a somewhat different trajectory. Unlike Davis, who maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming video evidence, Riley eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and multiple other charges. Her guilty plea spared her from the death penalty, but guaranteed that she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Riley's defense team argued that she was under Davis's domination, that drug intoxication had clouded her judgment, that she was more victim than perpetrator. But prosecutors presented evidence showing her active and willing participation in the crimes. The videotapes didn't show a reluctant participant being forced to act against her will. They showed someone who was engaged, who contributed to the victim's suffering, who made choices that led to 2 deaths and the traumatization of a child. The judge sentenced Dena Riley to multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. She would spend the rest of her days in a women's correctional facility in Missouri, isolated from society, paying the price for the choices she made in 2006. Unlike Davis, she would have to live with those choices for decades, waking up every morning in a prison cell, knowing that 2 women died because of her actions and that a child was traumatized because she participated in her kidnapping and assault. The families of Michelle Huff Ricci and Marsha Spicer were left to grapple with unimaginable grief and trauma. Not only had they lost their loved ones in horrific circumstances, but they had to endure the knowledge that their final moments had been recorded, that their suffering had been documented and preserved. Some family members attended the trials, forcing themselves to be present even as the most painful details were revealed. Others couldn't bear to be there, finding the public examination of their loved ones' deaths too overwhelming. The case received extensive national media coverage. News outlets across the country reported on the videotaped murders, the Interstate Manhunt, and the eventual trials. Crime documentaries and television programs featured the case, including episodes of Deadly Women and The Killer Speaks, examining the psychology of the killers and the details of their crimes. For some, this coverage was important, shining a light on a case that demonstrated the capacity for human evil and the importance of vigilant law enforcement. For others, particularly the victims' families, the constant media attention was a source of ongoing pain, preventing them from moving forward and healing. The community of Independence, Missouri, was deeply shaken by the revelation that such monstrous crimes had occurred in their midst. People who had lived near Davis and Riley, who had perhaps seen them at the grocery store or passed them on the street, had to reconcile the normalcy of those encounters with the horror of what those 2 people had been doing behind closed doors. It was a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs, that monsters can look like ordinary people, and that vigilance and awareness are necessary even in communities that feel safe. The case also raised broader questions about criminal justice, the death penalty, and the nature of evil itself. For supporters of capital punishment, Richard Davis represented exactly the kind of offender for whom the death penalty was designed. Someone whose crimes were so heinous, so devoid of any mitigating circumstances, that execution seemed like the only appropriate response. The fact that he died of natural causes before his execution could be carried out was, for some, a denial of justice, a final escape from accountability. For opponents of the death penalty, even a case as clear-cut as this one raised concerns about state-sanctioned killing, about the possibility of executing innocent people in other cases, and about whether execution truly serves the interests of justice or simply satisfies a desire for vengeance. These debates continue, with the Davis and Riley case often cited as evidence for both sides of the argument. The videotapes themselves became a source of legal and ethical debate. Should such evidence be destroyed after the trial or preserved for appeals and historical purposes? Who should have access to them? How do we balance the need for evidence with the dignity and privacy of the victims and their families? These questions don't have easy answers, and different jurisdictions have handled similar situations in different ways. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Richard Davis and Dena Riley case is the question that can never be fully answered. Why? Why did they do it? What psychological processes led two people not just to commit murder, but to torture their victims and record their suffering? Experts have offered various theories. Some point to Davis's apparent sadism, his sexual arousal from inflicting pain and dominating others. Some suggest that the relationship between Davis and Riley was itself toxic and mutually reinforcing, with each encouraging the worst impulses in the other. Some note the role of drugs in lowering inhibitions and distorting judgment. But none of these explanations feel sufficient to explain the depth of cruelty demonstrated in this case. The truth is that some acts of evil resist explanation. We want to understand because understanding feels like a form of control, a way of preventing such things from happening again. But sometimes the only honest answer is that we don't fully understand, that the human capacity for cruelty exceeds our ability to comprehend it, and that we must accept the existence of evil even when we cannot explain it. What we can do is remember the victims. Michelle Huff, Ricci, and Marsha Spicer were real people, not just names in a true crime story. They had families who loved them, friends who missed them, and lives that should have continued for many more years. They deserved so much better than the fate that befell them. And while their final moments were filled with pain and fear, we can honor their memory by refusing to let them be defined solely by how they died. They were more than victims. They were human beings who mattered. We can also remember the child who survived, Davis's niece, who endured trauma that no child should ever experience. Her identity has been protected, as it should be, allowing her the privacy to heal away from public scrutiny. We can hope that she has received the support and care necessary to recover as much as possible from what happened to her, and that her life has not been permanently defined by those horrific days. The Richard Davis and Dena Riley case stands as one of the most disturbing chapters in American true crime history. The videotaped nature of their crimes, the extended torture of their victims, the kidnapping and assault of a child, and the interstate manhunt all combine to create a case that shocked even those familiar with violent crime. It's a reminder that evil exists, that vigilance is necessary, and that justice, even when delayed or imperfect, remains essential. If this case has affected you, if you found yourself disturbed by these details, that's a normal and healthy response. It means you still have empathy, that you still recognize the value of human life and the wrongness of cruelty. Hold on to that. In a world where such darkness exists, our compassion and humanity are what separate us from those who commit these acts. I want to hear your thoughts. What aspects of this case do you find most disturbing? How do you think we as a society should respond to crimes of this magnitude? And what can we do to honor the memory of victims like Michelle and Marsha? Leave your comments below and let's continue this important conversation. If you found this video informative or thought-provoking, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss future content. Share this video with others who are interested in true crime and criminal justice. And if you want to support the channel further, check out the links in the description. Thank you for watching, for listening to this difficult story, and for keeping the memory of these victims alive. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember that justice, no matter how long it takes, still matters.